name is Cristina Antelo, and I'm the CEO of Fair Ox Strategies. I think I'm also the resident lobbyist for A2A, or for the Alumni Society. And so today I'm here for your recent civics lessons. I would highlight to you all that today in the Congress, in the 117th Congress, we have 9 white men that are named John. And there used to be a joke in Washington, D.C. that there were more white men named John in the United States Senate, 100 senators total, than there were people of color. And up until about 2 years ago, that was true. That had been true forever until we finally were starting to elect some members of Congress that were starting to look more and more like America. And that is something that has been something that is so important to me over the last 2 decades, that I've really invested myself, not only kind of for my clients and what have you, and doing my job for the various firms I've worked for, the various clients, but this has been the personal passion that I've had. And I have to tell you that going back and looking at January 6th and watching kind of what's happened to our country over the last 4 years, and a lot of that strife being based off of the fact of seeding in racism across the board, but specifically even the several instances that we've seen against Latinos, that has really kind of sparked in me kind of this renewed passion, this renewed urge, and several times along the way thinking to myself, like, are we really making any progress? Are we really being accepted here into this country that many of us have maybe even predated some of our white colleagues around the way in some parts of the country? Are we being accepted and being asked to be a part of the table and part of that conversation? And in this last election, it is the hashtag most diverse Congress ever. This is it. And for the first time in the United States Senate, there are 6 Latinos. We make up 18% of the population. And this is the most Latinos we've ever had. African Americans are even kind of have a tougher spot. There are 3 African Americans. That's how many there were last time. That's the most that there's ever been at one time. They make up 12% of the population. And then I look over at the House of Representatives. These are record numbers for the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the Asian Caucus. They make up now almost 100 members in total, which is more than we've ever had. There's over 140 women in the United States Congress. And now with the election of President Biden, we finally have been able to kind of break the glass ceiling on a lot of different positions, not only a woman of color in the vice presidential spot, but across different agencies and what have you. And so with that, I guess I wanted to kind of bring kind of the lessons that I'm learning from that in the activities, and what that could mean for us kind of as a society. I think that the Alumni Society, at many of the events that I've been to over time, talks a lot about wanting and needing to diversify our corporate culture. And what does that mean in C-suites? What does that mean kind of in the boardroom? And I would submit to you that it's equally important to do that from the political perspective. For example, take the conversation around the minimum wage. The minimum wage, has been stuck at $7.25 probably since I was a teenager. And, every time we have this conversation, it strikes me that in the Fortune 500, how many CEOs of color are there? There are a handful. And I submit to you that I think that conversation around the minimum wage would be substantially different if 18% of the Fortune 500 CEOs were Latino, if half of them were women, if 12% of them were African American, if those CEOs, if those boards, if those C-suites looked like America, would that conversation be different? And it's equally important to me that lawmakers represent the same perspectives of those that have had those kinds of hardships. To have grown up through hardships and then be at a place where you're able to impact policy, to be able to have that conversation is so very important. And so then, kind of again, looking at what we were going through last summer and watching the response from the constituencies around the country and voters around the country, seeing them be actively engaged, seeing them actually say, it doesn't even matter that there's a pandemic, that I can't go to a rally, that I can't knock on doors. You saw people really, for the first time in our communities, stand up and say, I want to be counted. I want to have a voice. I want to take a role and play a role in this election. And in a place where, like in several states where it really made a difference, new states that now, people are talking about, like, are they in play? And do voters do voters of color stay in play and engaged in the conversation? For me, that's kind of been kind of one of the highlights, one of the hopes that I have kind of going forward. There have been many times over the last 4 years where it's been a cynical process to see, and you start to wonder, like, are people, paying attention? Do people care? Is this, again, are we included? Are we part of this conversation? And so then I, kind of looking towards kind of what we can do in the next cycles to ensure that Latino voices continue to be included. I think that in various communities, it's important that we communicate kind of what are the policy ramifications, what are the interests of our communities, of our families, what is important to us, and making sure that we're still kind of, again, bringing our own seat to the table if we're not given one, and kind of making sure that we're included as people continue to divvy up that pie, and know that, again, communicating that across to our constituencies, kind of what are the benefits that come, and kind of what are the detriments if we don't participate. Registering to vote is obviously the easy and fast one, and getting out there to vote, but kind of making sure kind of along the way, I think, there's always this hyper focus on races that are at the top of the ballot, a presidential race, for example, but even in the localities where you are at the state and local side, having more interest and more play there, I think is equally important. So in all of that, I would bring back kind of the continued also power that we have as a community to support candidates, to encourage then those candidates, if they are able to win in office, to have staffers of color. I think that's another piece of it that is important, to ensure that, the average and median age of staffers is 27 years old, making sure that those staffers are of color and have those same kinds of communities of interest in mind when they think about it. Several years ago, when the Black Lives Matter movement really took place, even before this last election, people started to think about policing and reform in that way, and judicial reform. The committees of jurisdictions, the judiciary committees, looked around and there were 0 staffers of color. So not only were there no members of color, but there was literally no one in the room to be able to raise their hand and say, yes, I know what it's like to drive while Black. I know what it's like to be Latino and to be pulled over in New York City and just be, for the stop and frisk. So it is important, I think, to kind of encourage your lawmakers, not only to support candidates, but to encourage them to have staffers that look like America, to be representative in those conversations. And then, to continue to have, the corporate dialogue. So even amongst the different corporations that you have, like, it's one thing to represent your corporate interests, but represent your employee interests, and kind of what does that look like across the board for a policy that impacts, your business at the top line, but your constituencies from that other level as well. Because I think that a lot of times those perspectives of a business aren't represented. The kind of down ballot, if you will, in a company, of how those different policies impact not just like, the folks at the top or even the stock prices, but to employ their employees. So I guess overall, the message is to continue to have hope in terms of even in the political strife that we saw last summer, and on January 6th, probably one of the darkest days that I had, kind of as a lover of politics, somebody who studied it since I was 15 years old, and really started to doubt our democracy. But the democracy is only made whole and made stronger if we continue to participate and not to give up, no matter what the cynicism might be.